The Nintendo Game Boy, that classic little light gray box that everybody knows about, everybody has seen it, everybody's played it, it's worldwide, it's national. Why is that? Well, I'm gonna tell you, so just stay tuned. When Nintendo decided to come out with the Game Boy, which was technically the very first mainstream portable type video game system that you could put different games inside. Now, regardless of whether or not there was one before, I really don't care. The Game Boy was the first major successful one, and maybe quite possibly the most successful one for many, many years. What they were deciding was which game should we pack in with it. Okay, now obviously Nintendo, being Japanese and they wanted to put in their mascot game, they wanted to put in Super Mario game. But someone told them in their infinite wisdom, said, if you want to sell a lot of Game Boys in Japan, pack in Mario. But if you want to sell a lot of Game Boys worldwide, pack in Tetris. And whoever made the decision to say, yes, we're going to pack in Tetris was one of the greatest moves that Nintendo ever did, because it did exactly that. Everybody picked it up, everybody played it. It came with Tetris packed in, and because of that, Tetris was technically one of the first app-type games. Why? Because it was simple to play. You didn't need instructions for it, you just picked it up and played it. Like games nowadays like Candy Crush, the big ones I'm talking about, or maybe Angry Birds. It follows that same premise because Tetris and the Game Boy was the granddaddy of the whole thing. Technically, it was the very first app type game. Now, I remember when I got my first Game Boy back in the day when I fell off my dinosaur. I told you the story about when I went to Reno and got my Super Nintendo. I got a Game Boy at the exact same time, but that wasn't the first time that I played it. No, my friend had one first, and we actually didn't even really call it the Game Boy. We called it like the portable Nintendo, because that's what it was. Even though it was in black and white and it didn't have a lit screen or anything like that, we didn't care. The graphics on it were way better than anything else that we were playing before it. We had those like Tiger Electronic games and other types of portable games that were kind of just like calculators. They were literally probably 1 frame a second, and they weren't even primitive. We're talking straight up prehistoric here, people. They were cheap to buy though, right? You could find them anywhere, and I guess they were good in a pinch, but man, when Game Boy came out, it was huge, especially when you could play the Mario games and you could play the Contras and the Double Dragons and everything like that. There was something special about them because Nintendo decided to make Game Boy versions of those franchise-type games. Hell, even, Metroid 2 is on Game Boy, a full sequel they didn't even make for the Nintendo. They made it straight up for Game Boy. So that's an example right there. All of the games were slightly different than the NES ones. Now, we didn't care that it was in black and white, didn't have a lit screen. It could have been because of cost cutting, I don't know, or maybe Nintendo just didn't want the kids to be playing their Game Boys all night long in bed, right? But there were ways around that. We didn't care. We had little flashlights. I seen my friends had little apparatuses even set up so that it would have lights that would shine directly on the Game Boy when they would play it, and they could play it in the dark or at night. And that's when the third-party peripherals came out like mad for the system. Remember that? Well, I don't know if you remember, but I remember. I'll tell you about it. There was a massive, huge case that you could enclose your Game Boy in. It was almost like a great big Game Boy coffin. And it actually kind of reminds me of Iron Man. It's like the Game Boy's inside of it, right? But it makes this huge other bigger Game Boy case out of it, and it's supposed to be giving you better button layout and bigger controls. It was just a ginormous, huge piece of plastic thing that was crazy, right? And then another thing that came out, of course, that I also had was there was a magnifying glass that you could get for it. It attached to it. It was a square magnifying glass. You could look at it, and it actually did enlarge the screen. I used that quite a bit. I don't know if it was wrecking my eyesight. Probably was, because it was sort of like wearing glasses that were not prescribed to you at the time, right? Just to make the screen bigger. And there were also lights. Of course, tons and tons of people came out with lights that you could attach to it to light up the screen. And I had pretty much all of them. And then traveling cases. There's tons of different traveling cases that you could get for it because, of course, it was portable, right? Now, you got to remember, at this time, nobody cares because everything is portable. Everything is portable. Your phone is portable. Like, it's crazy what phones can even do. Even when I look at them today, they're totally portable. But the Game Boy wasn't. Video games weren't. You couldn't just put a Nintendo Entertainment System in your pocket and play it whenever you wanted to. So it was actually quite revolutionary. And it took 4 AA batteries, but they did last quite a bit because there was no lights and there was no color. So even though it was black and white, there were advantages to it in terms of making the batteries last quite a long time. Now, one thing that I bet you don't know, and if you know this, you are one of the most observant retro gaming people of all time. If you watch Star Trek, okay, Next Generation, the one with Captain, Jean-Luc Picard, Data, Worf, and all that, you can see that sometimes there is a medical case, okay, that Crusher and some other people, or maybe even I think I saw Data carrying it. That is a Game Boy case. That is a third-party Game Boy case. I had it at the time. If I can find pictures of it and show you in this video, I don't know if I can find it. I'll look on them in Google and find it. But can you believe it? They used an actual Game Boy case in Star Trek. Now, when I finally got my own version of Game Boy, I loved it a lot because, like I said, it took the trip to Reno. We drove there. It was a very long drive. We had to stop off at hotels, yada, yada, yada. And it was a great thing to just play in the car. I played it the whole way there and the whole way, the whole way back because I bought it when I was there. So coming back, it was great. It was fantastic. So I have my own personal favorite games for it. The 2 games that I did buy for it right away was Final Fantasy, the first one. I think it's called Final Fantasy Adventure. And I did buy Double Dragon for it. And both of them were pretty good games. But the later titles that came out that I bought were actually quite good for what the system can do. One of my favorites was Castlevania Belmont's Revenge. So I think it's called Castlevania Adventure 2 Belmont's Revenge. Incredible game. It's got great music, great graphics, great concept. Unbelievably good game. Then I bought Final Fantasy 2, the Adventure 2, and then that one was blue cartridge, and then the purple cartridge was the Final Fantasy 3, Adventure 3, and that game I want to talk about the most because I played that game the most, and it was mind-blowing of what Squaresoft did with that game. They pushed the graphics so far in it. I couldn't even believe that Game Boy could actually do this kind of stuff. And you, like, all of the graphics for the enemies, you could see your characters in front, where the other ones before, they were more like a Dragon Warrior style. You just saw the creatures and you didn't really see much attacking or your own characters. And part 3 showed them all. It showed all the different weapons that would attack them. It showed the swords, the axes, all the magic spells. Crazy story, big game, big adventure. That game's definitely, for Game Boy, is 10 out of 10. I was one of the last titles that I did buy for it before I stopped playing it, and still to this day is one of the most amazing portable games that I ever played. So this is why the Game Boy has that iconic shape to it that everybody recognizes. They know it. It's almost like the universal symbol for retro gaming, I would think, even more so than the NES system. You just see the picture, or they probably even have an emoji of it, I don't even know, but you just see it, you know what it is, it's instantly recognizable. And just, I'm so glad that Nintendo came out with it. There's so many other portable games that came out since then, but I think the portable systems at this point in time, because of phones and such, they're kind of dead. There were so many at the time, even when Game Boy came out, because then you had the Game Gear that came out, and you had the TurboGrafx Express, and then you had the Game Boy Advance came out after that. You even had Neo Geo Portable. There were a lot of games that you could play on the go until basically the phones came out, the smartphones came out, and I think kind of pretty much crushed it. I mean, the Nintendo DS did go on for a while. I think it's still out today, but it's like, I'm not talking about just like the one system surviving. I'm talking like as a whole, there isn't much in terms of portable video game systems. Like even the Switch, a home system, is actually portable itself. So I've seen other channels take old Game Boys and that were broken. They found them at a swap meet or whatever, and they restore them. I urge you to watch these channels. They're fun to watch. They totally restore them to like new condition again. But what I liked was they installed things inside of them with technology we have nowadays that we didn't have, that were not possible back in the day. They put these little LED light strips on the inside that you can't even see. They're hidden between like the glass and the screen. You got to watch the video how they do it. Hooked right up to the like the power button and everything, so when you turn on the Game Boy, now it's actually backlit. That I don't know, to me that's interesting and just kind of crazy, you know, that they just take you're still playing the original Game Boy, but here now we've put in something in it that kind of should have been in it since the beginning. And then of course you have the Super Game Boy. They came out with that cartridge that could actually fit into your Super Nintendo, and you could play all the Game Boy games on that, and I think you could make them into Game Boy Color at the time too. I didn't have one, my cousins had one. I was kind of out of the Game Boy thing, but it was really interesting to have it, that you could just hook it up to your TV. You didn't need any backlighting or flashlight to actually look at the screen or anything. It was right there on your TV, and you could play all of your Game Boy games in all of their glory. So that's it about the Game Boy, the granddaddy and grandfather, and I would say mascot, symbol of all retro video game systems. I loved it back in the day. There is a little Game Boy kind of light that I'm going to be putting on my shelf back here that I thought was pretty cool. It's a little novelty Game Boy that's got some LEDs in it, and it's just like battery powered, and you turn it on and it looks like it's a lit up Game Boy. You'll see it in the background probably next time when I get it. So there's all these cool things. You can get them on mugs. What are those mugs, that the coffee mugs, and they don't show any pictures on them, and then you pour the coffee inside and you can see the Game Boy game come on when you have hot liquid inside of it. There's so many neat things that you can get for it that is basically a symbol. That's just, the Game Boy is essentially a symbol, and that's what it's transformed into, and I love it. I love it. I love anybody who has it. Tell me some of your stories. Do you have any of the memorabilia? Do you have like the Game Boy pillow? I don't care what it is. Tell me about it down below in the comments. And if you did like this, and if you want to see me talk about another retro system, click over here. And if you want to subscribe and see more of the content, of course, click the bubble right up here. And I'll talk to you guys next time.